Hello everyone, my name is Davia and I wanted to speak to you in a little bit more detail than what I've been posting with regard to some of the Chinese fine art that I've been posting, and to explain a little bit more about what a universal understanding is. A universal person in the Chinese eyes has an understanding of arts, literature, ancient cultures, history, politics, and science. And in the past, in imperial China, to become a government officer was a very, very difficult thing. It required a lot of studying and very, very complicated examinations. And every 2 years, the Chinese government would appoint around 300 new people out of the whole of China to become government officials. Interestingly, one of the requirements was to be able to write poetry extremely well as being able to talk about politics and economic theory. So the question is there a business advantage in understanding Chinese fine art and Chinese philosophy in general when we consider that 1 billion people in China do seem to have quite a bit of economic pull in the world today? So we've got a picture here from an ancient Chinese scroll. And this scroll shows in the center is a pharmacy. It's called the Li Pharmacy. Now, they give out medicine. Now, this street, it's part of a very long street, is in Kaifeng in China. It used to be the capital of China, and this was the beginning of the Silk Road, or the end of the Silk Road, because for the Chinese didn't call the Silk Road only the Silk Road, they called it the Silk Cotton Road. That's because it was a two-way street. China exported silk, but they imported cotton. They weren't good at making cotton and or growing cotton rather, and so for things like for certain types of clothing, particularly for underwear, they were particularly keen in being able to have cotton as well as for towels and that type of thing. They of course exported silk, and we can see in the picture there's a businessman, quite a successful looking businessman. He's got some staff with him. He is on a horse and his staff are with him, accompanying him on foot. And he's below the pharmacy. The pharmacy boasts of giving out pills and medicine to cure the disease. Now, next door to the pharmacy is a temple. It's a very important thing to be aware of. It's a temple. It has got a willow tree which is brushing the roof. One might say it could be like a sucker. And that temple is debatably potentially also a bank. And behind we can see there's a curtain at the back of the of this temple or bank, and some people might say that that's a metaphor for the Babylonian curtain, because obviously this road goes all the way to the western part of the Silk Road, which would have been Babylon. It would have been going into the parts of the Middle East, and then for goods would have gone then obviously onward to Egypt or to Rome, Greece, and so on. So next to the on the other side of the pharmacy is what's called a well. It's a very, very important thing in Chinese culture to understand, um, or in ancient Chinese culture, because of course, when the Communist Party took over China, they started to work on excluding ordinary people from understanding the ancient imperial systems of China, with a view to basically cutting off history. So archaeology was banned, uh, and a lot of the ancient ideas were dismissed. And that wasn't the first time. China's done that at different times. In fact, in this scroll and on a later episode, we're going to look at book burning and so on. But in any case, it's important because there's a well here, and beside the well, there's a man, and he's got a what's called a lug pole. They'd call it a lug pole in would be the Chinese translation, and he's balancing water on that. So that's a metaphor for a politician. He's got to balance the interests of opposing factions, um, and he's looking into the well. Now, what's the well? Well, the well is a very, very important topic. A kind of, I think, Zion type of thing would be the Chinese original terminology for it. It means the source. It means the source of a special type of understanding, and that understanding is uh, very, very, very important in Chinese culture because that is the notion, metaphorically, that the universe was once a circle, which is the circular part of the well, and that intellectually they squared the universe, which is by the image of the wooden framework around the well, which then is an extended metaphor for the Chinese science, and I think we can call it a science, of change theory. Change theory. So that means that the Chinese didn't just look at time in terms of chronological time, like it's 3:15. They looked at time from the aspect of human situations or human interactions with the relativity of time. And why is that important? Well, it's very important because that information was, in many respects, hidden in the West in ancient books. And so, to give you a feel for the types of things that they would discuss in that book, which is some things that we can get onto in some later episodes, but they would talk about things like creativity. That creativity was a period of time you could engage in. You could be a creative person. You could dream up new ideas and so on. And and that's something that we'll open up a little bit later. But that goes on to notions of difficult beginnings. That at the beginning of any new situation, there can be some complications, some difficulties. That in any situation, regardless of how old or young you are, how experienced, unexperienced, how or inexperienced rather, how well educated you are, regardless, at the beginning of something new, there's always going to be things that you don't know and you don't understand. So that requires education. And education requires at the very beginning a recognition by the people who are going to engage in receiving the education in experience. Because that means that the recipient of the education has come to terms with the fact that there are things that they don't know, that they don't understand, and therefore have a need for a teacher. And in Chinese culture, in ancient Chinese culture, you would have to pay a teacher. You'd have to pay a teacher who would have a good knowledge and understanding of the ancient classics and all that they involve, which are quite There's quite a lot of things involved in that. And that process would take patience. So there's a notion where patience was a very, very important part of life. Um, and that there were also in life conflicts. So you could have conflicts within the self, you could have conflicts within the community, you could have conflicts within the country, you could have conflicts internationally. So because of this conflict issue, the Chinese were quite keen on education. They wanted to educate barbarians who would disrupt the flow of goods along the Silk Road, because for the ancient Chinese, they called the the Silk Cotton Road the furnace, and I'm quoting here, the furnace of liquid gold. So this was a uh, a trade mechanism, a trade conduit that created huge, huge wealth for the imperial coffers, just as it did on the western side of the Silk Road, where it's well known that when Alexander the Great took over a certain city in the Middle East, he became the richest man in the world, probably even in today's money, the richest man in the world, if you were to convert it, the richest ever man in the world, because that was where the taxation for the Silk Road on the western side was being paid. So that would then take on to the notion of a what the Chinese might call an army, the army idea, or what you could also call the collective force. How you get all of these things together, get them together in a positive way, in a well-ordered way, and that is it. So a well-ordered way, and to unify people. So you wanted to get some unity involved in what was going on, and this unity would require restraint at times. That would mean that people would have to exercise restraint in their conduct. So conduct was well defined, and the notion of restraint was particularly important for this type of system to work. And of course, government officials, knowing about this system of, let's say, science of time and political management, would understand the importance or the all critical nature of being able to be restrained at times, particularly if you had a large army. It was important. And then, of course, conduct was an issue which was well defined. And with all these things going well, that would be the creativity, the understanding of difficult beginnings, the notions of a correct education, patience, the importance of understanding fully about conflict, about how collectively things could be brought together, how you could unite people, how you could restrain things, and how you could conduct things correctly. That would lead to prosperity. So that prosperity was seen by the Chinese as a very, very important thing. And if this wasn't being done correctly, which would be so in Chinese terminology, when you had the notion of let's say the sky, or you could say heaven, but they weren't. Well, we'll unpack that a little bit later. But let's just say the sky notion, the universal sky. When the sky was above the earth, and the earth was corresponding to the universal principles, then that set the conditions for prosperity. Things were going to go well if the things happening on earth were consistent with the universal laws that were observable from earth, and how the planets moved and how the stars moved and so on, or from the observation of how nature was taking place in earth, the natural types of responses. Whereas when earth was being put, or the needs of men were being put before the universal principles of good order, then that would lead to stagnation. Things would go badly when men were putting their own self-interest before the greater good, let's say. And so, to correct these things, they had the notion of community, where between themselves, in a friendly, positive, intellectual manner, things could be discussed, and any conflicts or any complications, lack of understanding, lack of education could be resolved, and that would then allow community to flourish and prosper, where the key objective of community was really to enjoy leisure. So to basically have a nice time, be happy. And obviously the for China, if all the men were away fighting, they weren't working in the fields, so they weren't growing food and so on. So there's all sorts of complications came from the disruption of the Silk Road. That's bandits hijacking and kidnapping people up and down the road, or not exactly kidnapping people. Well, I suppose they might have done, but certainly stealing the goods and stealing the money of the merchants and so on. And with all of these topics all working out together, that then brought together the imperial system of order, which would be imperial sovereignty at the, let's say, the larger side of it, and within the South, that would be the notion of personal sovereignty. So I've written quite a lot about these topics in my books, my two books. I've written a book called Moneydie and another book called Art for War, which are both got some very strong Chinese themes, and they're about these universal principles in understanding how the arts, literature, ancient cultures, history, politics, and science defines what China is today, what China was in the past, and what the Western world is also, except that curiously, in the Western world, some very devious things took place to bias and misrepresent some of the fundamental universal principles. So, more soon. Bye bye.